Real Talk with Zuby podcast. On today's episode, we have got on a brilliant guest hailing from the UK, and this is Dr. Rakib Ehsan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Zuby.
Awesome, man. So, Rakib, for people who are not familiar with you, please tell them a little bit about you.
So, my background, Zuby, I focus on matters of social cohesion, race relations, and public security, especially in the British context. My PhD looked at the impact of social integration for non-white ethnic minorities living in Britain. So I'm primarily interested in matters of social policy, and I also have quite a strong focus on the effects of family breakdown, which is something I think is not talked about very much at all in British social policy circles.
Awesome. And tell me a little bit about your background. How did you, before you got into all of this work, what's the story behind it all?
Well, lived most of my life in Luton, which I just found out you're actually born in these neck of the woods. A very interesting place to be raised in. There's been a fair share of problems with Islamist extremism, but also far-right extremism. The English Defence League was created in my hometown. So I think naturally in that sense, I was naturally interested in matters of social cohesion, how to develop bonds of social trust and mutual respect between different ethnic, racial and religious groups. And that's naturally, that's something that I carried into much of my academic work at university. And in that sense, I'm also very interested in how to build stronger relationships between citizen and state. This is something that you've talked about a great deal, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. I do feel those bonds have become increasingly under strain. So I'm very passionate about people believing in their public institutions and feeling that those institutions are responsive to their needs and grievances.
Awesome. What was it like growing up in Luton for you? Because I was born there, but I've actually spent very little time in the city, and I didn't actually primarily grow up in the UK myself. So what was life like, and how have you seen it change over time?
Well, I think that I've talked about those extremist influences in the town, but I'd say that overall we have a very tolerant, humanitarian, law-abiding majority. I wouldn't choose to be raised anywhere else in the world, and I genuinely mean that. I think that you have communities which are deeply family-oriented, civic-minded, and I think in that sense, because we have that strong anti-extremist, resilient core in the town, that's helped to neutralise that extremist threat, both in terms of Islamist extremism and the far right as well. I think that on the whole, it's a fantastic place to be raised. I call it hyper diverse. But ultimately, for example, the football club, which is doing incredibly well at the moment, pushing to get promoted to the Premier League, it's a very important local institution, and it's those kind of local institutions that help to bring together people of different backgrounds, and I think it's beautiful to see.
Awesome. Why do you think it is that Luton, of all the cities in the UK, has become this hotbed, as you said, for various types of extremism? What is it that's created that? Is that simply a result of such a wide level of diversity, or is it something else?
I think that, Zuby, I think that it's similar to other parts of the country. There is a great deal of residential segregation in towns such as Luton. I think another town that would spring to mind is Blackburn, up in Lancashire, where you have what I would consider to be parallel societies. You have communities living together in the same town, but they interact with each other in a very minimal way. I think that's certainly the case in the past. And I think naturally in a town which I'd consider to be predominantly working class, you combine that with the perceived competition for resources, and you have groups which that positive intergroup contact isn't really taking place. It can breed suspicion of the unknown, and I think in turn that provides fertile ground for extremists to really make headway with their divisive otherizations of different ethnic and religious groups.
Yeah. So tell me more about how you got involved in this work. So I understand the background and what could lead to some interest in it, but what made you decide to pursue this as a career?
Well, I'm very passionate about having strong levels of social cohesion in Britain. It's a country that I care about a great deal. I care a great deal about maintaining high levels of cohesion in towns such as Luton, because the reality of the matter is, while people talk about the enriching impact of diversity can also bring its complications. And I think all too often when you raise that, people say, oh, but that's very bigoted to say, or rather, this is something that's very controversial. But it's a reality, Zubi. And I think that if you have groups that they're not having those positive forms of contact with one another, whether it's in the workplace, or it's in schools, or whether it's in those kind of sort of civic settings in our local communities, I think that's quite a problem. Britain, as you know, has a fairly comprehensive welfare state. But I think in order to sustain collectivistic endeavours such as a welfare state, you need strong levels of trust between different groups. I think if different groups believe that, oh, the values that I hold dearly, that's not really shared by a different group in society, it's almost that that sort of undermining of social cohesion can actually weaken support for the welfare state. So I think in that sense, I'm a bit of a left conservative. I have quite traditional conservative views, but I do believe that we should take care of the neediest in society. I believe in having a well-funded, high-performing education system, which is funded by the state. So I think in that sense, my sort of core beliefs, that's motivated much of the work that I've done. And I think that that's ultimately taken me on this path where I really want to champion these causes in the think tank world, based in London, and also in influential social policy circles.
I'm so happy you brought up this point of diversity bringing challenges, because I think for the past 10 years or so, there are certain buzzwords which have been very, very popular: diversity, inclusion, equality, tolerance, and I think people like to talk about them on a very shallow and superficial level, right? People just like say diversity is our strength, diversity is wonderful, but they don't really like to define the terms or acknowledge, okay, well, when you say diversity is our strength, what do you mean by that? When you say diversity, what do you mean? Do you just mean different skin colors? Do you mean different ideologies? Do you mean different nationalities? What specifically do you mean? And also, what are the challenges? I mean, obviously, if you take people of differing cultures, languages, backgrounds, ethnicities, classes, all types, ideologies, and you put them all in one place, sure, there can be good things that come out of that, but people are going to bump heads, people are going to clash, people are going to misunderstand each other, some people are going to fear each other or have certain prejudices and so on. So I feel like it's been this very one-way conversation, just on a shallow level of saying, oh, diversity is great, inclusion is great, but people not really wanting to address the concerns some people have. And I think by not addressing some of those concerns, that is something that, in my opinion, can give rise to more extremism, right? So genuine hyper-nationalistic far-right factions and things like that, whether it's in the UK or elsewhere, I think if those people sort of in the middle and in the center fail to address or are completely unwilling to talk about any of the people's concerns, then it kind of gives more power to people who are more extreme to say, oh, look, okay, well, here's why they're not talking about it, and then they can kind of spool all these other ideas and kind of get more people on board.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that when people champion diversity, but you actually ask them to explain what you're championing, they struggle very quickly. I think on a superficial level, cultural diversity, it can add vibrancy to a community, whether it's in terms of cuisine, for example. But I'd say that's quite superficial, if I'm being absolutely frank. But I think when you're talking about almost what I consider to be moral relativism, I think that you can stumble into some very serious problems. I think Britain is particularly weak at this, where we don't really have a common, robust moral cultural standard. You have people saying that this cultural practice is as valuable as another cultural practice. That's not necessarily true. And I say this as someone who is of Bangladeshi Muslim origin. There are certain cultural practices, even within minority communities, which should be called out. And I think that when we're looking at, for example, um, religious extremism, I think that all too often we've been paralyzed by the forces of cultural and religious sensitivity in a way, in terms of calling out practices. I'll give you one example: female genital mutilation, honor-based violence. I think these are problems which still exist in modern-day Britain, and I think that if we had taken a more robust approach in terms of assessing the drawbacks of multiculturalism, instead of how do you say, prioritizing difference over cohesion, then we would have been better able to tackle those kind of practices. So I do feel that when people say, diversity is an unadulterated good, I don't completely agree with that. I think when it comes to that diversity, equality, and inclusion space, which is developed in recent times, I think you very quickly find out that people in that space are not necessarily pro-diversity at all, especially when it comes to viewpoint diversity. I also feel that I'm a big believer in equality of opportunity, but I think all too often it's ultimately about an equalisation of outcomes, which I think is something that we should oppose in the strongest of terms. And the same thing with inclusion. I'll give you an example, Zubi. In the National Health Service, we have diversity, equality, and inclusion professionals. But their focus isn't really about, for example, knocking down cultural barriers to healthcare services that marginalised communities need. It's more about talking about white privilege within the National Health Service, which is quite remarkable, because some of the poorest communities in the UK where the healthcare services are crumbling are predominantly white. So I think that we really need to examine what people mean when they talk about diversity, equality, and inclusion in modern day Britain.
Yeah, most definitely, man. When you talk about cohesion, which is a word you used quite a few times, what exactly do you mean by that? What does that cohesion look like to you? Because something I wonder in these conversations is, same with the word multiculturalism, because the UK does have a culture. Great Britain does and should have its own culture, and within that there's of course a level of diversity and what you could consider multiculturalism. But again, in one way, if multiculturalism is too deep and exaggerated, then it doesn't work, right? Because you just get this complete clash of cultures and values, and some of these things that you've already discussed. That doesn't work. I mean, I grew up in the Middle East. I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and when I was in Saudi Arabia and my family was there, and there are all these other expats from all over the world, you recognize, okay, I'm in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia does have certain laws and rules, and customs and ways of doing things. So we will respect that. It doesn't mean that you have to completely suppress your own culture and beliefs and so on, but there are just certain aspects of it that it's like, okay, this is something that, to take something off, drinking alcohol, right? Drinking alcohol, or during Ramadan, not going around and eating a cheeseburger and drinking a Pepsi in public, right? Just basic things, how you dress, whether you're a man or a woman. There are things that I would wear in the UK or I'd wear in the USA, like a tank top. I go to the gym, I'll wear a tank top or something like that. And I wouldn't wear that if I'm going out. Yeah, it's a respectful thing to do. Yeah, it's respectful. I've got a gold chain out right now, right? I might just tuck that in to respect the culture a little more. And for me, that's fine. So there are little compromises that need to be made to ensure that cohesion. And so absolutely, it can work in a way, but I think again, that's something people have to acknowledge. It can't just be, all right, let's just throw people from all over the world together in this one place and magically hope that they're all going to get on. And I think that the way you described it there is it perfectly represents some of the problems that we have in the UK. I think we've had a laissez-faire approach to multiculturalism in that sense. I think another term they used was proved to be very useful is deep multiculturalism. I think that what I talked about before, I think on a more superficial level, cultural diversity can add a great deal of value to a local community. But if it's deep-seated multiculturalism to the extent
that different groups are, that their primary values are so different, I think that can place social cohesion under strain. And I think you made a really good point about those little compromises, which they sound little, but they go a long way.
Yes.
When it comes to building trust between different communities. I think that those little compromises count for a lot. Something that I talked about earlier, being of Bangladeshi Muslim origin, I don't think there's any harm, for example, someone being proud of their Bangladeshi culture, the Bengali culture, or indeed, Islam forming an important part of their daily life. But I think it's more that if, because of your ethnic background or your religious beliefs, you treat certain groups differently, or in my view, you start treating them unfairly, I think that is what needs to be called out. I think that if you believe that because you follow a certain belief system or you have a certain ancestral background, that you're somehow superior to a fellow citizen, I think that I definitely, that's where the red line really needs to be drawn, Zubi. So I think that's what I mean by cohesion. I think people can take pride in their own personal background, their religious affiliation, but if it impacts on how they treat fellow citizens in their own country, then I think that is anti-cohesion in nature.
And I think that's a fantastic point. And funnily enough, I think it's interesting because we're in this weird climate where it's myself and yourself both being British, but not being white British. We actually have this type of protection almost in a way, right? It's easier for us to discuss topics like this honestly, I think, because there are certain charges and accusations that can't really be levied at us, or if they are, it falls flat, right? Someone might try to call myself or yourself a white supremacist, or but it comes across ridiculous, right? Whereas if this were two white people having this discussion, then it gets very people very quickly want to dismiss all of the concerns as some type of racism or xenophobia or hatred, which is not fair. That's not fair. That's an overcorrection that people always need to be cautious of and watchful for, and I think that's something that has arisen to some degree in places like Luton over the past couple decades. There have been those factions. You mentioned the English Defence League. Of course, going further back in time, there have been things like the British Nationalist Party, which was actually promoted white nationalism and so on. And I think with many issues in society in general, we always need to be cautious about the overcorrection. I think there's often overcorrections, many of them over the past decade, where in an attempt to supposedly address one issue, you go so far overboard and create a whole new set of problems. I think that there's been an overcorrection in the conversations around race and ethnicity, or in racism. I think there's been overcorrection. I think the whole past 2 years with COVID was an overcorrection. I think there's been lots of overcorrections with modern day feminism, overcorrections with lots of this gender ideology stuff that's going on. It just seems to be overcorrection after overcorrection, and those can have very negative consequences, and they can also breed resentment, because I think few things breed more resentment than people believing they're not being listened to, right? They have concerns,
absolutely.
Right? They have concerns, they have worries, and every time they try to raise them, people shut them down, or they call them names, or they disparage them, and so on. And I think that can lead to bad and nasty places.
No, absolutely. And I think that you've really touched on something very important, that resentment that can be created from that feeling of not being listened to, especially by the political establishment. I do feel that I do agree with you in that in some ways we can get away with saying things that white people might not be able to get away with in this current climate. I think that's the truth of it. I feel that when it comes to my personal background, I can, for example, make criticisms in terms of, say, extremism within British Muslim communities, which are predominantly non-white communities. I can make those criticisms that someone who is white British, they may feel uncomfortable in terms of making those criticisms because of their background. And I don't think that's completely fair, if truth be told. I think that if you live in a multiracial democracy such as ours, ultimately the points you make, if they are perfectly legitimate and reasonable, you should be free to air them. And you shouldn't feel like, oh, because of my background, I'm not able to articulate my particular viewpoint. A viewpoint which may even add value to the broader debate. So I do feel that in that sense, if you're talking about cultural marginalisation, I think some of the most culturally marginalised communities in the UK are probably those left behind white working class communities, especially in deindustrialised areas. And I suspect that dynamic might be quite similar in the United States as well.
Yeah, I think it is, especially in, because it's not, we live in a very strange and interesting time, because every group, and I fully understand this grievance because it's fair, right? Every group, with the exception of straight white men or white people in general, is sort of quote unquote allowed to have advocacy groups and is allowed to sort of play this identity politics game. And I don't think that's I don't really think it's sustainable in that way. I think that ultimately it creates, like I said, this resentment over time. And when people are just beating white people with a stick constantly, accusing them of white privilege, or saying saying stuff that you wouldn't be allowed to, it wouldn't be socially acceptable to say about any other group of people. You can go on social media any day and you can just see awful, very broad brush stuff being said about, and it's like, wow, if you said that about black women or black men or Asian people or Jewish people or what, like you'd be in trouble, right? People wouldn't be okay with it, but it's like, oh well, they targeted white guys, so that's fine. And I don't know. I also think it's deeply hypocritical, because if the goal is equality, and fair treatment and non-discrimination, that should fly in all directions. Like right? Yes, and that's something I really respect about your work and your words that I've seen out there, which is that the direction doesn't matter, right? You have so many people, honestly, like many people on the modern left now who have this. It's not an equalist perspective. It's like, okay, well, they'll even say, you can't be racist to white people, for example. Right, that sort of
power
statement.
Structures.
Yes, because privilege and power, and so on. Like they do this mental gymnastics that suddenly makes it okay to say something really, really horrible about this demographic.
Absolutely.
But if that same thing were said to another demographic, then they'll be the first to jump on you and accuse you of everything. I'm like, look, like if we're going to be equal, let's be equal. Let's be fair. Like let's not be nasty to anybody. Let's not make these huge, sweeping statements about generalizations about any group. I don't care if they are. I don't care what religion it is. I don't care what skin color. Let's just not play that game. It's been very, very nasty in the past. It's been very nasty in many places around the world. We can see where it leads. So let's not, toot this horn about equality, diversity, inclusion, and kindness, and then not play it. Like let's live it. I care less about what nice phrases people are saying, and I'm more watching. Okay, how do you actually treat people? How do you actually talk about other people? That's really what matters.
No, absolutely. And I think just touching on white privilege theories, I think completely redundant in the British perspective, from a social, in terms of social policy. The white male is portrayed as a hyper-advantaged section of British society. But when you actually look at, for example, educational outcomes, attainment 8 scores, which is the average score across 8 GCSE level qualifications, the white working class boys are doing terribly.
Yeah.
Right? That's the truth of it. Well, you have a range of ethnic minorities coasting ahead. Interestingly, when you look at levels of life expectancy, white men fare a lot worse than a range of racial/gender groups as well. So I think that when you look at, and another example, actually, come to think of it, is suicide ideation, where suicide risk and levels of self-harm. That tends to be higher within the broader white population when compared to the broader Asian and black population in the UK.
Probably
so really
homelessness as well, I imagine. I haven't seen the stats, but it looks like
I think it goes on and on. So I think it really proves that white privilege, as a theory, that is all it is. And I think it's remarkable that some people present it as a sort of incontestable fact. From a social policy perspective, it really isn't. I talk a great deal about the importance of family structure, stable family structures, and how that can pave the way for young people to do well at school, build more robust forms of mental health, physical well-being, not being involved in the criminal justice system. If you look at rates of family breakdown, Zubi, they're particularly low within a range of non-white communities, relatively low compared to the white British mainstream. And I do think one of the finest advantages you can have in life is belonging to a stable and loving family unit. So I think that what white privilege does, it places race at the forefront of very important debates on very complex forms of social and economic disadvantage. We need to look at things such as family structure, what kind of community that you're raised in, whether or not it's a high trust or a low trust community. For example, what's the level of public and private sector investment in your neighborhood in terms of creating opportunities for mobility. But I gather that those kind of factors are not quite as fashionable as race.
Man, and fashionable is the right word for it. Because we live in this very funny time, Rakib, where everything you're saying to me is commonsensical. And it's also what I was raised with from very young. I mean, I grew up in where I was raised in Saudi Arabia from the beginning. I was surrounded by people of different races, ethnicities, backgrounds, nationalities, religions, just from the beginning, right? Like, so I'm always kind of gobsmacked. Like, I'm somewhat shocked, even though it's been many years. I'm still shocked when I see in countries like the UK or US, these modern Western countries, and a lot of the rhetoric and even some of the policies and things that people are advocating for are so regressive compared to what I grew up with. When I'm suddenly hearing people having these conversations, weird conversations about race, or I was talking to someone. I recorded a podcast with a young American woman yesterday, and she was telling me about how when she was in high school, at the age of 14, they had some activity where they had to go into different rooms based on their race, right? Racially segregated rooms to have certain conversations about, their race and their place in their oppressor-victimhood hierarchy and so on. There are universities with in the USA right now where they have racially segregated spaces. I'm in the world of music. Yes, I'm in the world of music. I've seen music events where they're charging white people higher ticket prices.
No.
Yes.
Really?
I
find that absolutely remarkable. I find it remarkable. I don't want any of that coming into the UK. If I'm being absolutely honest.
And that's why I spend a lot of time in the US now, and I have a large American following, but I keep a close eye on it because, as we know, I think a lot of Americans don't understand why people in the UK and other nations are interested in what's going on with their social, cultural, and political environment. And actually, it's because, if we're being honest, a lot of these ideas, they come from the USA, right? This notion of white privilege and this idea of everything being white supremacy. Like, they're fringe American
ideas. These are key US
ideas.
Exports now.
Yes, these are US exports. And then a couple years later, you start seeing it in the UK, and all of a sudden these words and this language and this framework is being applied, even with things like, if you remember, just think back to 2022 after the George Floyd killing, and you had these BLM chapters coming up in the UK and in Australia and Austria, places where they barely even have black people. And you're trying to sort of retrofit this idea into the UK, and I'm like, this whole movement doesn't even really make sense for the UK. Like,
it really doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, just to show how brainless this kind of importation of US racial culture politics is, we had BLM demonstrations in the UK where protesters were chanting "Don't shoot" at British police officers, majority of which are unarmed, and they support that model of being unarmed as well. The vast majority do. So I think that really demonstrates that the US is a society, irrespective of people's views on the right to bear arms. You have high levels of gun ownership in the mainstream population, and I think naturally that means the US police is operating on a very different environment when compared to the British police, where in the UK we do have strict gun controls. So I think what you see there is, I think the problem with the UK-based anti-racism movement, they look to the US for far too much inspiration when it's a very different cultural and political context. And I think that really undermines the credibility of the anti-racism movement. I've seen acronyms such as BPOC being used by British anti-racists. I stands for Indigenous, which would be Native American in the US context. So if they're looking at minority oppression, the truly indigenous people are people, Anglo-Saxons living in the UK. So I find it absolutely remarkable. I really do. So I think that what that tells you is, I think that some of the things that are coming from US educational facilities, especially on race-related matters, I think that it could be deeply corrosive for British race relations. I don't think it's doing much good for US race relations, but its importation in the UK is something I also feel it's weakening the British left in an electoral sense. I think that this sort of overemphasis on race as a form of disadvantage, it doesn't really reflect the reality of British society. I think when the research that I've done personally shows that more broadly, non-white people in the UK are more satisfied with their life and are more satisfied with the way democracy works in the UK when compared to the white mainstream. So I think it's really important that anti-racists, they focus on, for example, I think there's a great deal to be said about how public institutions can be more responsive to the needs of an ever-diversifying population. I think that's very important. I think that in terms of police-community relations, I think that practices such as stop and search, for example, there's no harm in police forces actually interacting with civic associations and community groups, explaining why there are disparities in stop and search. That could be down to, the kind of neighbourhood that stop and search is taking place. I do think that it's important for the police to develop strong ties with the communities that they serve, especially when it comes to justifying the reasons why they're using practices such as stop and search. But I think those are the kind of things that the British anti-racism movement should really focus on, and ultimately keep the focus in terms of building stronger race relations in the UK, stronger state-citizen bonds in the UK, as opposed to drawing inspiration from what I consider to be deeply divisive pseudo-intellectual movements in the US.
And it's important to note that in the U.S., it's not helping in the U.S. either. So, not only is it not very relevant to the UK, it's also you're importing something that's not effective. That's actually, as far as I'm concerned, very, very counterproductive in many ways. I would say that, on a surface level, I haven't done any deep analysis of this, but in the U.S., it seems that over the past 5 to 10 years, certainly, what you could call race relations have declined. I think people seeing their cities burning on fire with protesters, screaming and shouting and looting, and that's not going to help make people's, and someone can say, oh, that's only a small percentage of people doing it, but what's the word I'm looking for? That doesn't matter in a way, because that's what people see, right? So just like, and interestingly, people understand this in certain directions. So, if anyone is being honest, and most people recognize that, everyone recognizes that most police officers are not,
racist.
Yes, are not racist and are not, violent. Most police officers are decent. However, a picture picture can be painted to make it look like, oh wow, okay, there is a ton of police brutality and police violence and so on going. So, you know, there are certain things that are so awful that even if it is a small percentage of people doing it, if it's not being addressed properly, yes, it's amplified, and it paints this picture in people's brains of what the problem is, and that can be very skewed, and it can be amplified by the media and so on. And I think a big problem with a lot of these issues is that if you can't diagnose the problem, then you can't properly apply a solution, or any solution that you attempt.
Absolutely.
Any solution you attempt, at best, it'll be futile. At worst, it might actually be counterproductive. And sometimes doing nothing. I think sometimes people always feel they have to do something, and then I'm like, you know, sometimes doing nothing is sometimes doing nothing.
Oh, I think you make a very important point, because I think this is also the problem with the anti-racism movement. That they almost feel like if we say, "Oh, a great deal of progress has been made in terms of race relations. We live in the most, one of the most racially fair countries in the world," they almost feel like they lose their own sense of purpose. Where, you know, what is the point of us existing? I actually make the point that there is still much to be done from a social justice perspective in the UK. But my issue is that if you over focus on race, this is the point that you made, that actually you're missing out on some very serious social problems which are non-race related. So for example, in the UK, when you look at children up to the age of 15 of Black Caribbean origin, 63% live in lone parent households. The corresponding figure for their peers of Indian origin, Zubi, goes down to 6%.
Yes.
Now that's naturally going to have some impact on how the young people in those two ethnic groups, how they progress in life, whether it's education and employment. That is going to have an impact. And you can see there that I feel that social justice movements in the UK, that they don't really want to talk about family breakdown, because they see the family almost as a kind of over-hierarchical reactionary institution.
Yes.
When from my perspective, it can provide the strongest form of belonging and rootedness for a young child being raised in the UK. So I think there, what I would say is that I call it the grievance industrial complex, where ultimately you have, it spans across a range of sectors, where people are ultimately, they're either profiteering or it's a form of moral grandstanding by ultimately opportunistically placing race at the heart of these very important debates on inequality and disadvantage.
Yeah, absolutely, and it just misses the issue. You know, if someone is constantly looking through this racial lens, and there are people who promote the idea that everything in life, every human interaction, everything, economic, social, everything should be viewed through this primary racial lens.
Prism of
Yes.
race, yeah.
Yes, and I'm just like, that's insane. I mean,
It is insane. It's remarkable. The idea that racial identity is the primary determinant in the shaping of life chances in the UK, it's intellectually inaccurate.
Yes.
That's the truth of it. I think even, you can talk about socioeconomic class. I almost think family structure trumps that in a way. So I'll give you an example, Zubi. When it comes to school performance, as you know, you have pupils who qualify for free school meals. If they're from a materially disadvantaged background. You have pupils in certain ethnic minority groups who are on free school meals, who are performing better at school than white British children who are not on free school meals, who are not from materially disadvantaged backgrounds. So you can even see there, I almost feel like family culture and community dynamics, they're overturning class-related disadvantages in a sense. So I really feel that this you almost have this race industry that places racial identity at the heart and center of these very important debates on youth well-being and development. They're doing our communities a disservice because they refuse, whether it's because of personal self-interest or that they're just not very knowledgeable of the on-the-ground realities. Their diagnosis of the problem is far detached from the reality.
I think what's really interesting with it all, out of the universities, there's been this concept of intersectionality, which has come out. And what I find really funny about that idea is that it ultimately leads back to what we already know and have established, which is that the ultimate minority is the individual, right? So there are all these different factors at play. Yes, you can look at nationality and socioeconomic class and family structure, and you can look at race and identity and gender and sexuality and all of these. And if you take all of them, what you come back to is the individual, right? Just because this person is a white boy and this person is a white boy, it doesn't mean that they have the same story and abilities. And they can be completely different challenges. Oh, this is a black woman and here's another black woman. So therefore, there's this idea that you're supposed to believe that makes them extremely similar. And I'm like, that is such a
it's very dehumanizing.
It's like this is going back to sort of race essentialism ideas from 100 plus years ago.
This is what you mean when you were saying earlier about we're regressing.
Yeah.
In that sense, we really are. I think that, and I think this is a very important point. I think there's far too many people in the anti-racist movement, and I don't wish to be overly insulting. Quite in a fairly mediocre way in their own personal life, and I think that the issue here is that rather than owning up to things that you could have done better in your own life, taking on personal responsibility and taking on individual initiative, I think can be quite liberating. But for some people, especially if they're dissatisfied with their own life circumstances, they would rather blame the system. It was the system's fault why I'm in this problematic situation. I wasn't able to achieve what I wanted to achieve because my school teachers weren't very good. I didn't receive the support I needed from the state. Now, there may be degrees of truth in that, but ultimately, I feel that if you have the correct attitude as an individual, and I still think that's where family structure comes in, because luckily I was raised in a family unit which encouraged me to take on personal responsibility. Not just about, taking credit for your successes, you also have to own up to your failures. And I think that helps with personal growth and development at the end of the day. So I think you make a very important point about the individual being lost in all of this. But I actually make this point that people want to de-emphasize the importance of the individual because it is in their personal interest to peddle anti-system narratives.
Yeah, I call it a permanent alibi.
Yeah.
Right? If you believe that the system and the structures and the institutions and everything is against you, whether you're a man or you're from this background or that background, or you're a woman or you're gay, you're black, whatever it is, right? They all have this, I like the term grievance industrial complex, right? But there's always, there's white supremacy, there's the patriarchy, there's systemic, institutional, structural racism, there's all these, and you never need to define them. You can just sort of say, the system.
Very abstract. Very abstract.
Very abstract. You can just sort of say the system or, the patriarchy or the white man or whatever, and people are like, yeah, you're right. So every time you fail at something, you can just go back to blame this. But to me, that's disempowering. And I personally find it insulting, right? I'm like, no, I'm a grown man, right? I'm a capable human being, right? I can be accountable and responsible for the good things I do, the bad things I do. If I say something that's out of line, that's me. Nobody made me say it. I do something that's great, cool, right? Like I did that, I achieved it. But I think with many people, as you said, they like to have this external locus of control.
Absolutely.
So that they then are not responsible nor accountable for any of their failures in particular. But it also means, I think, that they can't really take credit for their successes. And I think that's ultimately a shame because, I just want to see people. I want to see people doing well, and I also recognize that if you have a positive attitude and mindset, as you alluded to, people will help you. And I think this is actually one of the most amazing things about this time that we live in, right? Most people, the truth is, I think most people just don't care about you enough to oppress you, right? Like most people are minding their business. Like
that's a very good point. That's a very well put point, actually. Yeah.
Most people are just minding their business, going about. You walk into any city, and you see people rushing around, doing their thing, taking care of themselves, right? They don't even have the time to be bigoted towards you. But quite the opposite. If you are kind to people and you put in effort and you are trying to do something good in the world, I find that most people, vast majority of people, will want to help and support you. Yes, there will be critics. They'll reciprocate. But if you have this really negative attitude that, oh, these people are out to get me, those people are out to get me, that will start to manifest. You know, because you won't treat people well. You will talk down, and then as a result, they'll be like, oh, I don't want to. You know, this person's kind of nasty. I don't want to.
It's a very miserable existence to lead as well, and I think that this is the problem that I have with much of the British left, really, that their message isn't one of optimism, and resilience and determination, and I almost suspect, people may well call me a cynic as a result of this, but I actually think that they would rather lock, for example, young ethnic minority Britons in terms of encouraging them to do well at school, make the most of the opportunities that you have in the UK. And the UK, for all of its flaws, it has some of the strongest anti-discrimination protections in the world when it comes to racial, ethnic and religious minorities. And it also has some of the most robust equality bodies in the world too. So instead of providing that optimistic message in terms of doing the best you can, work hard at school, remain disciplined, stick to a routine, they're more focused on vilifying public institutions, education systems, and I think it's because that they want to dampen aspiration instead of promoting it. They want to dampen aspirational attitudes, because they feel that by doing so and then ultimately facilitating the growth of anti-system sentiments within the younger population, that helps to expand their anti-racism movements. Maybe that is very sad to see.
Maybe that's the real systemic racism.
I think in a sense that the anti-racism movement, I think there's a balanced message. I think they can say that we have made a great deal of progress in terms of race relations and equality of opportunity, but there is still much work to be done. Ultimately, they want to overlook the progress that's being made. And what I feel about the UK, which, as I said, I think that it has a very strong culture of anti-discrimination, far more so than, interestingly, than a number of major European countries, which some people in the UK seem to admire. But I think that really that's more down to the fact that they have these anti-British tendencies when they look to continental Europe as a basis of tolerance and openness. But I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Well, I think a question I like to ask people is what they are comparing things to. And, so when someone says, I don't know, there might be a debate on TV, is the UK a racist country? Right? And that'll be that's the debate. And I'm like, what does that sentence even mean? Compared to what? Right? Are you comparing?
I think there's points to be, if you're making an evaluation about the UK, what people are going to do, they're going to compare it to other countries, and that's when the UK fares quite well on those kind of indicators. I think that, for example, if you take France, for example, they don't even collect data on the grounds of race and ethnicity. So if there's a particular problem within a racial or ethnic minority group, because of their culture of almost this sort of rigid secular universalism, they almost feel like if we collect that kind of data, we start breaking down French society. So at least what Britain tries to do, they collect that data and they try and identify particular problems which may be impacting more heavily on particular sections of society. So what I say, when people say, I've heard people say that, the UK is a terrible place to live as a Muslim. Firstly, there's polling that shows that 3 in 4 British Muslims believe that Britain is a good place to live as a Muslim. So they're not even representative of the broader Muslim population. But when you compare the life circumstances of Muslims in other countries, you very quickly see that the majority of Muslims in the UK, they have it very well. Their life circumstances are far more favourable. So the point I make is that ultimately when you talk about that statement, which is often held without the UK is a racist country, compared to what other countries are you comparing it to? We have an impressive government minister here, which I'm sure that you're aware of, Kemi Badenoch, who's of Nigerian origin. She recently said that Britain was the best place in the world to be if you're black. This was treated with,
people don't like that.
outraged. And then you make the point that when you look at the experiences of black people in other countries, especially if they're countries of origin, what she said is extremely controversial. I don't think it is.
I think, I don't know, there is a strange self-flagellating mentality that is in British culture, and I think perhaps some other Anglo societies where you're supposed to be so browbeaten and so guilty about, say, maybe perhaps historical sins that, in a way that many other countries are not, by the way, even if they should be perhaps, that you can't acknowledge or take pride in the progress or in the good things. I mean, that statement that she made, that should fill people with joy. And it's an accurate statement, right? So someone who's like, okay, there's 200 or so countries in the world. I don't know, name 5, or name 10 that you think, would
yeah, more favourable in that sense.
Yeah,
I think it's the same. I think this is a fantastic place to live on the whole, being Muslim. Especially when you see the degree of religious freedoms which are offered under British democracy, and also those culture of anti-discrimination protections on the grounds of race, ethnicity, and religious belief. So I think that back in the day, the British left would celebrate this. They would champion this progress. But now, a celebration of British progress, ethnic minority success. They can't even bring themselves to acknowledge it. They really can't. Because the problem with ethnic minority advancement, it fundamentally undercuts their white privilege narratives. So, and I think you see that in the US, where people of Chinese origin are now being Chinese and Indian origin to ethnic groups are performing very well in the UK and in the US, being described as white adjacent. I mean, the mental gymnastics here is quite remarkable.
I don't know if you've seen, Ricky, in some of the official statistics now white and Asian is one group. So they've actually they've combined them in some of the. So if you look at some of the university, they keep all this data and analytics. I've noticed that over the past couple of years now, it's white and Asian, and then it's Hispanic.
Yeah,
Black,
I mean, I've seen a great deal of data manipulation in my time, but that really takes a biscuit.
Yeah.
I have to say it's quite remarkable. But I think that demonstrates the degree to which some elements of society they want to conceal forms of ethnic minority progress and achievement, and I think that's a crying shame because. In the past, what I could consider to be the old-fashioned left, they'd celebrate ethnic minority success, successful forms of economic integration, educational advancement. But now, because they're so obsessed by their precious white privilege theories, they dare not mention these forms of success.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Rakib, man, I would love to chat to you for so much longer, but where can people find you online?
Well, they can follow me on Twitter. As you know, I'm ridiculously active on there. My handle is at RAKIBEHSAN. And I'm also in the process of writing a book titled Beyond Grievance, and that can be pre-ordered on Amazon.
Awesome. Dr. Rakib Hassan, thank you so much for coming on, man. Been great to chat to you.
Thank you for having me.
I am the man, sick with the slang, sick and I'm destined for fame. Do for the fam, not for the gram, spelling you're destined for pain. I do not front, I do not scam, put some respect on my name. Sick like Cobain, click and I bang, y'all gon' remember the name. Y'all gon' remember the name.
These days it's getting harder and harder to find savings. But you may have more cash than you realize in your home's equity. Unlock it today with a cash-out refinance from Rocket Mortgage. In the last year, average home values have gone up nearly 20%. That means you could unlock thousands of dollars from your home. And with Rocket Mortgage, you could get all that cash in as little as 3 weeks. Put your hard-earned money to work. Pay down high-interest debt and combine your balances into one simple, low monthly payment. Now is your perfect opportunity to take control of your financial future. So what are you waiting for? When you want to consolidate debt and simplify your finances, Rocket can. Call 8338-ROCKET today or go to rocketmortgage.com to get started. That's 8338-ROCKET or go to rocketmortgage.com. Rocket. Call for cost information and conditions. Equal housing lender licensed in all 50 states. NMLS consumer access.org number 3030. Call 800-490-1233 for disclosures and cost information.
Heat, rehabilitated, and real entertaining. This is the Carl Jackson Podcast.
All right, welcome to the Carl Jackson Podcast. I'm joined today by none other than John Lott. He is the author of More Guns, Less Crime, The War on Guns, also the founder of the crimeresearch.org. But good Lord, John, I forget the name of your website right off the bat, the Crime Prevention Research Center. I often look at John's website. I've read his material and I read his material. I've listened to plenty of his interviews. This is the man to have on to discuss Biden's speech last night, also what we see transpiring with these public mass shootings. I think the left is trying to mislead us down a dangerous trail, and so I wanted to have John Lott on today. John Lott, thank you for joining us today on the Carl Jackson Podcast. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks very much for having me on. That's nice of you.
Absolutely. John, listen, let me start right off the bat, and I'm looking at your website, crimeresearch.org, and I just started reading through some of the material that you have there. But one of the narratives that the left often puts out are anti-Second Amendment people. And by the way, for those of you that don't know, John was is a researcher, but you specialize in economics at first, did you not, John, before moving to researching gun stats, crime, so on, etc.?
Right. I have a PhD in economics. I've been an academic most of my life. I've had positions at Stanford, University of Chicago, the Wharton Business School, Yale, UCLA. But the thing is with economics is a pretty simple idea. It's the notion that if something's more costly, people do less of it. If there's a greater incentive, they do more. And that applies not just to the price of apples. If the price of apples go up, you buy fewer apples, but it applies to something like crime. If you make it riskier for criminals to go and commit crime, they're going to commit less crime. So it's the same basic idea there, and you can make it risky for criminals to commit crime in many different ways, with higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences, but you can also make it riskier for them to do it if victims are able to go and defend themselves. And so I was chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission, and I've been doing a lot of research on crime, but I've never really been interested in gun type issues. I kind of got into it by accident. I was teaching a class at the Wharton Business School on crime more generally, and I made the mistake of telling the students that we were ahead in the syllabus. And I had a couple students that came up to me after class one day and said, well, if you have time, and we know it's not exactly on the topic, but
you cut out on us,
we might
John.
talking about gun control a little bit. And, I'd read a number of papers in the area. I thought that they were all poorly done. But to teach a class on it, it kind of forced me to read through the literature more completely. And I have to say, I was very disappointed by the quality of the research that was being done.
Wow.
And, as an academic, you do research papers either because you have a new idea, which is like 95% of what I did, or because you think you can simply do a better job than others have done. And, I ended up writing something, and it got a lot of attention. And I kind of got stuck in doing it for a while.
Well, I tell you what, you are fabulous at what you do. I want to start off with this notion that the U.S. leads the world in mass shootings. I often hear liberals say this, but that isn't the case, is it?
It's not even remotely true. Look, if somebody were to compare the murder rate in Rhode Island or Wyoming with Florida, where I guess you may be from,
yes.
Nobody would compare the number of murders in Rhode Island with the number of murders in Florida, because the population of Florida is massively larger. the population in Rhode Island. What you would do is you'd put it in per capita terms in order to make the comparison. What's the rate per 100,000 people? But for some reason, when we're talking about mass public shootings, people don't make that adjustment. The United States has over 330 million people in it. You look at Europe, for example, you have countries like Finland and Norway, which are about 5 million people each. You just can't, or even Germany. Germany is the most populous country in Europe, and they're 80 million people. So that's like 1/4. That's less than 1/4 the population of the United States. You have in France is like 1/6 the population of the United States. So you have to adjust for them. So take something like mass public school shootings. Since 2000, in the United States, if you're talking about attacks where 4 or more people have been killed, you're talking about 8 mass public shootings. Is that 8 too many? Before the Texas one? Yeah, sure it is. But when you take Germany has 2 big school shootings, and one in which 18 people were killed, another one in which 15 people were killed. You multiply that by 4.25, you end up getting a number that's the same as the rate in the United States. Or you have a country like Finland. Finland's had since 2000 had 2 school shootings. But you have to multiply their number by 60 in order to get the same per capita rate. So obviously that's going to be, a much, much, much higher rate than we have in the United States. But just, if you look at mass shooting generally, if I were just to compare Western Europe and the United States, do you know which country between Western Europe and the United States has had the deadliest mass public shooting? It's France.
Wow.
Paris.
Wow, really?
In 2015. In November 2015, at a concert in France, 130 people were murdered in a mass public shooting. Do you know which country has the second largest, most deadly mass public shooting? It's in Norway a decade ago. If you ignore the bombing deaths that occurred there, they had 67 people that were shot to death. So, both of those attacks are significantly more deadly than the worst mass public shooting in the United States. Since 2000, or in fact ever probably, do you know what is the worst school shooting in the world? It was in Russia in 2004, where 183 students were killed.
That is right. That is right.
And so, the thing is, you have these attacks occurring in other countries. They're occurring frequently in other countries. But when they get news coverage, if they get news coverage, it's usually just a very brief mention one time in our media. And whereas if we have an attack here in the United States, it's going to get coverage day after day after day. And so it's not surprising that the media covers attacks in the United States much more than they cover attacks in other countries. And it's not surprising that people pay more attention to it. But it's really, there's a lot of things with regard to news coverage here in the United States that really gives people a biased view of how we compare it to other countries. There's one other part about mass public shootings that I'll mention, and that is on our website at crimeresearch.org, we have literally dozens of cases in recent years where what otherwise would have been a mass public shooting was stopped by somebody with a permitted concealed handgun. And yet these attacks will virtually always only get local news coverage. Many of them are dramatic cases in which police have said many people would have been killed if it wasn't for the permit holder that was there. My guess...
You know what, John?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go right ahead. I'm sorry.
My guess is the entire debate that we have on gun control in the United States would be very different if 2 things occurred. One is 96% of the mass public shootings since 1950 in the United States have taken place in areas where guns are banned. And you know, it's, but how often does the media mention that? You know, so you have this hospital shooting that just occurred a couple of days ago here. It was in a place that was a gun-free zone. Civilians were banned from having guns there. The Texas school shooting was in a place where guns were banned. 30% of the schools in Texas, public schools, have either teachers or staff carrying guns at school. Unfortunately, the attack at the Robb Elementary School was at one of those where guns were not allowed by teachers and staff. You look at the Buffalo shooting. If somebody reads this racist manifesto that's there, one of the things that he spends time talking about is how he picked the target that he did. And the big thing for him was trying to avoid any place where people would have permanent concealed handguns, because he said if you had civilians with permanent concealed handguns, that would make his job much more difficult. A lot of the gun control people say, well, a good guy with a gun didn't stop it because you had a uniformed armed guard there who wasn't able to stop. Here's the thing. If you have somebody in uniform who's the only person at a place who has a gun, he has an incredibly difficult job. He stands out like a sore thumb with a uniform. His uniform, if he's the only guy with a gun, his uniform is kind of saying, like a neon sign, shoot me first. Because if you take out the one guy who's in uniform, who's the only guy with a gun, then the murderer has free reign to go after other people there, to go and stop them. If you're going to have a guard or a police officer, don't put them in uniform at these places. If you're going to have, so a lot of Republicans are talking about, well, we need to have uniformed police officers at these schools. Having one police officer in uniform, first of all, it's an incredibly boring job. I mean, you have a police officer at an elementary school, we have thousands, tens of thousands of elementary schools across the country. We have a few attacks at elementary schools. It's a very boring job. And for a guy to be there day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, it's very hard to be on your toes all the time. You also don't have eyes in the back of your head there. And so these attackers have real tactical advantages in going after the person in uniform. If you're going to have a police officer at a school, have them blend in. Have them teach a class. Have them be the PE teacher or something. Have them be on staff. But don't put them in uniform there. And but the thing is, if you have people with concealed handguns, you take away the strategic advantages that the attacker has. And even if you are going to have a uniformed guard there, it makes the job of the guard